On this Tuesday night, a new suspected case of the coronavirus in Canada. What we know about the latest patient, and what about the Canadians under lockdown in Wuhan, China, who want out?
We're looking at all options.
Plus, balancing fear with facts. I ask an expert in infectious disease about whether trying to contain it is working. The UK says yes to some Huawei 5G technology, defying the US. What will Canada do? Backlash to President Trump's Middle East peace plan. Why critics say Israel is pulling all the strings. And taking a perilous plunge in Antarctica.
This place is under threat.
One man's call to action while braving bone-chilling waters.
Global National with Dawna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We are continuing to monitor the outbreak of the mysterious new coronavirus tonight. The number of confirmed cases in China keeps soaring nearly a week into the biggest quarantine in history. And another presumptive case has been identified here in Canada. A man in British Columbia who is in his 40s and regularly goes to China to work has isolated himself and is waiting for test results. There are 2 confirmed cases of the coronavirus in Ontario, a husband and wife, both in their 50s, who recently came back from Wuhan, the center of the outbreak. The virus has now spread to Japan and Germany, and in both cases, authorities say the people who are ill did not travel to China themselves, but were in contact with someone who had. The German Ministry of Health now says 4 people were infected after attending a company training event last week with a colleague from Shanghai. As many as 40 people may have come in contact with the woman. In China, there are now about 6,000 confirmed cases, and at least 132 people have died, most of them in Wuhan. The U.S. and the U.K. are sending passenger planes to Wuhan to repatriate their citizens. There are 250 Canadians registered in the region. Foreign Affairs says 126 have contacted the consulate asking for help to get home. But at this point, Canada is not sending a plane to get them.
We're trying to contact everyone, assess their specific need for assisted repatriation. We're at the same time consulting with our allies and looking at the different options that people are considering.
The U.S. and the U.K. have now upgraded their travel warnings, advising citizens to avoid non-essential travel to all of mainland China. And several airlines are cutting back on flights to China. At this point, Canada has not expanded its travel warning and is still advising people to avoid the Wuhan region and Hubei province. Redmond Shannon has our top story tonight.
As if further evidence were needed that these are extraordinary times. Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam wearing a face mask, an item she banned last year during the pro-democracy protests. Lam announcing that visitor permits and most travel from the mainland will be limited after Thursday night. Hong Kongers like this man think it's too little, too late. 8 cases have already been reported in Hong Kong. In Beijing, the head of the World Health Organization met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. They agreed for a WHO team to join the 6,000 Chinese medical staff who've been sent to the affected region. The organization says the emergency remains confined to China, but the global risk is high.
So far, it's going back with travelers to foreign countries, whether it's the home country of somebody or a traveler as such. It's not wildly spreading outside of China. But again, we have to be prepared for in case it would.
In Wuhan, state TV shows the much-hyped building of a special new hospital, some prefabricated rooms already in place. Most people living in the city remain holed up at home, many shouting encouragement to each other from apartment windows.
We are not really sure if they are reporting the truth or if they are underreporting the actual numbers or I think it's just not knowing what's actually going on and how long it's gonna last. That's the most scary part.
And cities near the affected Hubei province are increasing checks to anyone arriving. Those with high temperatures sent to hospital immediately. And more than 1,000 kilometres away in Beijing, some empty shelves and long lineups as the first death from the virus is confirmed in the capital. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
Now to what we know about the cases here in Canada. Here's Heather Yourex-West.
Health officials say Canada's third presumed case of novel coronavirus did everything right.
This is a gentleman who was well aware of what was going on in China, and when he returned, he went home and he voluntarily self-isolated.
The man had recently traveled to Wuhan, China, but did not have any symptoms until more than 24 hours after he returned.
This person was not symptomatic on his flight. There's no risk to people who are in contact with somebody with no symptoms.
But there are questions within the global medical community around whether or not that statement is true.
Normally with a coronavirus, we see more viral shedding and more transmission when a person is more symptomatic. China has reported there may be evidence of asymptomatic transmission. All of these questions must and will be answered in order to provide a proper risk assessment.
The Chinese embassy in Canada is advising all Chinese nationals returning from Wuhan to isolate themselves for 14 days at home. So far, all cases across North America have been traced back to China.
The coming days and weeks are likely to bring more confirmed cases here and around the world, including the possibility of some person-to-person spread.
Studies on the new coronavirus show that on average, one sick person can infect between 1.5 and 3.5 other people. That makes it a bit more infectious than most seasonal flu strains, in which sick people can infect between 1 and 1.5 others, but less infectious than SARS, which spreads from 1 to 2 to 5 others. It's why public health officials are doing all they can to prevent an outbreak, isolating and testing anyone who traveled to Hubei province and has now become ill.
We need to be very vigilant. There are people who have traveled, who are here, who might be incubating this virus, who might be becoming sick in the next couple of weeks. And that's why it's so critical that we maintain our focus.
Because the success of their efforts will be measured in the days ahead. Heather, Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.
As this story keeps evolving, there are many questions, and it's important to balance fear with facts. So to help us do that, I'm joined again by Dr. Michael Gardam. He's an infectious disease specialist and chief of staff at Humber River Hospital in Toronto. Dr. Gardam, let's start with the news of the confirmed cases in Germany and Japan. In both cases, the people had not traveled to China. The man in Germany was in contact with a woman who had come from Wuhan, but apparently did not have any symptoms until she was on the flight back there. Does that raise alarm bells for you about the virus spreading and possibly spreading when people don't have symptoms?
Well, you know, certainly seeing cases that are occurring in places where this has been imported, where somebody who traveled has given it to somebody else. We've been looking for that the whole time along, so that isn't a big surprise. The issue here is how contagious is this virus when people have mild symptoms? And honestly, it's really hard to sort of set worldwide policy on one case, right? So we really need to be cautious saying that the virus is highly infectious in that setting. Typically with viruses, people are mildly contagious if they have minimal symptoms, and they're much more contagious if they have a lot of symptoms. So it's possible it can certainly transmit if people have mild disease or maybe even no symptoms, but it's certainly less likely than if they're sick.
So is it too early then to be definitive about the transmissibility of this virus when people are contagious and how exactly it's spreading?
Absolutely. I mean, we need to take a step back. I mean, typically with other viruses, what we've done is we've looked at people where we have a good idea when they got infected, and then we're doing serial swabbing on them to see at what point they start to shed the virus, at what point that they start to develop symptoms. None of that has been done with this particular virus, so I think we are too early to get very definitive about how it is transmitted. If we take a big step back, though, and look at the epidemiology, the spread seems to be similar to what we saw during SARS, which is that people who are sick are the most likely ones who are actually spreading it.
Well, given the unknowns and given what you just said, should people who have been to the Wuhan region be self-isolating as a precaution?
Right now, that's not recommended. I mean, it's a very good question. Right now, what we're looking at is people who have symptoms. That may change over time, but you can imagine if we start to broaden that case definition where now anybody who comes from Wuhan is isolated, or take it even further, a lot of calls I've been getting today is why aren't we isolating every person who's even been in China? You can imagine that very quickly overwhelms the public health system. So early on, we have to be very sort of surgical in what we're doing, and if necessary, we start to move out. We have to remember the area that's been locked down. We're talking 35-some million people. So the vast majority of people from that region do not have this virus.
Okay, we'll watch and wait and hopefully speak with you again. Dr. Gardam, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
To other news tonight, the U.S. says it is disappointed the U.K. government has given Huawei the go-ahead to build parts of its new 5G network. President Donald Trump claims the Chinese tech giant can't be trusted and is a threat to national security. But it is the world leader in 5G technology. And as Abigial Bimman reports, Canada, too, is on the cusp of making a big decision about it.
Should we be developing our own technology?
British ministers meeting at 10 Downing Street to discuss Huawei deciding to allow the company to be part of a future 5G network with restrictions. So-called high-risk vendor involvement is capped at 35%, and they're not allowed to be part of the core, where sensitive personal data is kept.
We would never take decisions that threaten our national security or the security of our Five Eyes partners.
The decision goes against what the U.S. wanted. They're worried about Chinese influence, and it leaves Canada as the only member of the Five Eyes intelligence network yet to make a Huawei decision. Australia and New Zealand banned it.
We know how important it is to make sure that there is both competitiveness in the Canadian industry, but also security for Canadian users. That's why we're working with our Five Eyes allies, working with international partners, looking at the security concerns.
It doesn't seem to me that it's in our interest to accept that risk.
You don't think Canada should proceed?
No.
Former head of CSIS, Ward Elcock, says Canada is in a different situation from the Brits.
They probably can push the envelope more than we can. We have a communication system which is integrated with the American system. I think that makes our problem harder than it is for the British.
We're very respectful of that process. We're participating in that process. And all we've ever asked, and I think it's fair for Canadians to expect this, is that any decision on Huawei in Canada is made based on cybersecurity and technology and not based on politics.
Of course, there is a broader context. 2 Canadians detained in China and Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou in the middle of an extradition case under house arrest in Vancouver.
I think it's very important that we get the 2 Michaels back, but it's not directly tied to that decision. Is it holding back your decision?
The public safety minister wouldn't answer. He says they're working on a made-in-Canada solution. While experts say if the decision is likely to be a no, they don't expect it to come anytime soon, given the high stakes with China. Abigial Bimman, Global News, Ottawa.
If the federal government decides not to go with Huawei, then what? Well, Rogers is the only big telecom company to begin rolling out a 5th-generation network in Canada. It's partnered with Swedish supplier Ericsson to provide the technology. BCE, Bell Canada Enterprises, and TELUS have yet to select a vendor. They're awaiting a decision from Ottawa. Nokia could be a big contender. The federal government announced $40 million in funding to the Finnish telecom giant last year to conduct research on 5G wireless technology in Canada. And Samsung is also a major player. It's already secured a deal to supply equipment to Quebec's Videotron. The case against Cameron Ortis was back in court today in Ottawa. He's the high-ranking civilian intelligence official with the RCMP accused of violating Canada's secrecy laws. Charges laid against Ortis were moved to the Superior Court by the Crown Prosecutor to speed up the trial. His lawyer says he's having issues communicating with his client because of concerns they might breach the Security of Information Act. Ortis was arrested in September last year, charged with preparing to share sensitive information with a foreign entity or terrorist organization, and with sharing operational information in 2015. His bail was revoked in November, and he's been in custody ever since. We now know the full cost of the failed prosecution of retired Vice-Admiral Mark Norman. The federal government spent more than $1.4 million on the breach of trust case. New documents tabled in the House of Commons don't reveal the breakdown of those costs. In 2015, Norman was accused of leaking cabinet secrets about a federal shipbuilding contract worth nearly $700 million. Norman was suspended, and last May, the Crown stayed the charge after it determined there was no reasonable prospect of conviction. Norman retired from the military after reaching an undisclosed financial settlement with the federal government. Palestinians are furious tonight at the American president. Coming up, why Trump's plan for peace has ignited protests. President Trump has unveiled his plan for Middle East peace. He calls it the deal of the century, but one party to it, the Palestinians, were nowhere in sight today. Israel's prime minister was, though. Benjamin Netanyahu, who was indicted at home today on charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, was by Donald Trump's side. Critics say that's the problem, that this plan cannot possibly lead to peace because it's an Israeli plan wrapped in an American envelope. Jackson Prosco explains.
Believing he can defy history, President Donald Trump revealed his plan to bring peace to the Middle East.
All prior administrations from President Lyndon Johnson have tried and bitterly failed. But I was not elected to do small things or shy away from big problems.
The 80-page proposal strongly favors Israel. It was drafted by Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and is already backed by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
It addresses the root cause of the conflict, by insisting that the Palestinians will finally have to recognize Israel as the Jewish state.
The plan would redraw the map, creating a Palestinian state with limited sovereignty. Israeli settlements in the West Bank would remain. Israel would also keep control over Jerusalem's holy sites.
Under this vision, Jerusalem will remain Israel's undivided, very important, undivided capital.
Almost immediately, protests erupted in Jordan, while Palestinian leaders who were not at the table branded the plan as a conspiracy.
It just looks like Trump, with all of his strong support of Israel from the get-go, is yet one more time trying to do a favor for his friends in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. That's what it feels like to most people.
Previous American presidents have tried to bring the two sides together to negotiate. That too ended in failure. Trump's plan was likely dead the moment it was announced, but it's already being used as a roadmap by Netanyahu, who plans to move ahead to annex West Bank settlements in the coming days. Jackson Prosco, Global News, Washington.
Ahead, the surprise protest against a controversial tennis player. In California, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board say the helicopter that NBA legend Kobe Bryant was on descended suddenly at 2,000 feet a minute and described the crash as a high-energy impact. Investigators spent all day documenting the crash scene. The remains of the chopper and all the bodies have now been removed. The crash killed Bryant, his 13-year-old daughter, and all 7 others on board. It was foggy at the time, and the pilot had received special permission to fly in low-visibility conditions. The helicopter did not have a terrain awareness warning system on board, despite the NTSB recommending the FAA make it mandatory on all helicopters like the one Bryant was on. It helps prevent unintentional impacts with the ground. 2 tennis greats are using the Australian Open as a platform to protest the legacy of a well-known Australian player.
There's only one thing longer than the list of Margaret Court's tennis achievements. It's her list of offensive and homophobic statements.
That's John McEnroe. He's criticizing the Australian Open for honoring Margaret Court on the 50th anniversary of her Grand Slam. She holds the record for Grand Slam singles titles, and she's been widely criticized for her homophobic and racist views. Today, Martina Navratilova grabbed the mic at Melbourne's Margaret Court Arena to demand the name of that arena be changed. The live feed was cut off as she tried to address the crowd. The 2 tennis stars then unfurled a banner to rename the arena after Indigenous champion Yvonne Goolagong Cawley. Next, why a swimmer took a polar plunge through Antarctica's ice glaciers. It's been 2 centuries since Antarctica was discovered, and the anniversary is being marked by a sobering world record. An Englishman known as the human polar bear has completed the first ever swim under the Antarctic ice sheet. It's part of his campaign to raise awareness about the impact of climate change and the region's dire need for political protection. Jeff Semple explains.
The world's coldest continent is both perilous and peaceful. Antarctica's icy landmass, twice the size of Australia, remained hidden, untouched by humans until 200 years ago.
Nobody'd been down there. All there was on the charts was ice. That was it. So they went actually off the charts.
This Russian naval officer was the first person known to have laid eyes on Antarctica's ice shelf in 1820. That discovery sparked a rush of hunters and other explorers seeking to plant their flag and lay their claim to Earth's final frontier.
Countries, for example, went to great lengths to put their Antarctic stations all over Antarctica and to raise national flags to say, we're here, we're busy, this is ours.
Some countries, such as Argentina, even transported a pregnant woman to give birth on the frozen continent, hoping to strengthen their claim. Today, those territorial tensions are mostly kept at bay, thanks to a global treaty of more than 50 countries, including Canada, to promote scientific cooperation. But the continent now faces a much greater existential threat.
Antarctica has been frozen for millions of years. At the end of the last ice age, the continent's ice sheet was shrinking at a rate of around 1 meter per year. But scientists warn that process is accelerating, the ice melting 6 times faster as climate change turns up the heat.
Lewis Pugh has seen the impact of rising sea levels up close. The British endurance swimmer, nicknamed the human polar bear, just became the first person to swim beneath an Antarctica ice sheet to show the world what it's about to lose.
I've never seen anything as beautiful as this.
Scientists recently revealed that underwater glacial melting is happening up to 100 times faster than they thought.
This place needs protecting. It needs protecting because all our futures depend on it.
Pugh is now calling on those same countries who agreed to share this continent to also help ensure it doesn't look much different 200 years from now. Jeff Semple, Global News.
And that's Global National for this Tuesday. I'm Dawna Friesen. Tonight's Air Canada is an update on those 2 Zamboni drivers who used their homemade Zamboni to clear their backyard rink in Vernon, BC.
Let's welcome 5-year-old Kyler and 6-year-old Asher to the rink tonight.
There they are. The Vancouver Canucks invited them to help clear the big rink, and even mascot Finn lent a hand, or a fin. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.